why we're here. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Imel, for coming today. I'll do a brief bio of Dr. Imel. Dr. Imel, Zac Imel, PhD, is co-founder and chief science officer at Listen.io. And Listen.io is a technology company focused on using artificial intelligence to assess and improve behavioral health. Zac, you're also a professor and director of graduate studies in the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Utah. You have many scientific publications. You have over 100 scientific publications, and your work has been funded by NSF, by NIMH, NIDA, NIAAA, PCORI, the John Templeton Foundation, and the Casey Foundation. You are co-author of the psychotherapy text, The Great Psychotherapy Debate, which offers a comprehensive review of the evidence for the effectiveness of psychotherapy. And you won the Early Career Award from the American Psychological Foundation Division 29, the psychotherapy division. And you're currently co-leading an NIMH-funded project evaluating the first implementation of AI-supported quality monitoring of crisis counseling. And we've through some of our projects, we've been so fortunate to work with you and work with Listen through a number of different implementation projects. And so we're thrilled to have you here today. So welcome. I'll pass the baton to you at this point.
Thank you. Really nice to be with everybody and to see some folks I've worked with. And Ming Tai Seal is on the call, and we had couple years where we spent a lot of time together, and so it's very nice to see your face, and Greg, of course. So I'm excited to share a little bit of the work we've been doing. The talk that I'm going to give today it's a bit of a overview with an attempt at doing some conceptual framing of how I'm thinking about what I think is a bit of a mini revolution in psychotherapy research that we're in the middle of, for better or worse. And so maybe I will just, with that, jump in. I will assume, unless people start raising their hands, everybody can see the slides. So a bunch of the work I'll talk about in here has been supported by a whole bunch of different grants. Some of them were to me at the university. Some of them were grants to Listen. And so that is a disclosure. I just want to make sure, as I will bounce between talking about work we've done at the University of Utah and also research we've done at Listen. And I founded Listen and I own a part of it. So you should just be aware of that conflict of interest. But this work I'm talking about is really the result of collaborators that I've worked with for a long time and students. So any failure to describe how cool this research is my fault and not theirs. So the framework I want to bring a little bit to this talk is the idea of, it's almost the idea of tools versus relationships. And I think sometimes when we're building new technology, we can forget, at least I can forget a little bit about the idea that it's not just about the cool stuff we're building, but it's about the way in which we're in relationship with it. And I think that is particularly relevant as we start to think about designing tools that get in the middle of human relationships or supplement or in some ways supplant them. And I think we need to do a little bit more thinking about that, particularly in psychotherapy. And so one way I like to think about this, this is like the history of psychotherapy research. If I knew you all better, I have a little icon over here. We could play some Taylor Swift love story background music. But this was a few years ago. This is what psychotherapy research looked like. And it was all nice and cute. And you'll notice all of these things are humans, right? So you have a human therapist and a human client, and they talk to each other. And then there's like a human who listens to that, and they might transcribe it, or they might just rate it, or maybe the human therapist or the human client is rating those things. And then one of those people rates the outcome. And it's this entirely human derived process. That's what it was, right? Now, the issue being, that's really slow. All of it is labor intensive. And you could pick any one of these points and say, well, gosh, I understand that we kind of need a human therapist, but it's really slow to train human therapists and they get tired. And wouldn't it be nice if we didn't have to have human therapists? Or, gosh, it's if we're doing research, it's really hard to train human coders and they get tired and they're unreliable and they can only do small amounts over long periods of time. So what we started doing a while back was experimenting with machine learning scientists. And this is back before AI was either cool or frightening. People just thought it was weird, right? They didn't know what we were talking about when we would say, well, what if we just automatically evaluated the content of a psychotherapy session? And the reviewers would kind of be like, what are you talking about? How would one do that? And so we started training what were early proto versions of the AI that everybody is familiar with and is getting shoved down their throats in every piece of software you have right now. Those same underlying technologies were available in early forms more than 10 years ago. And so we've been working with those in a variety of ways to try and evaluate the content of psychotherapy to make that easier. And so that allows you to do things like embed annotations of conversations directly in transcripts, do research on them, provide feedback to people for QI. We've worked with some folks in this group to do just that. It doesn't solve every problem in implementation science, even close, but it takes one problem, which is how do we measure what people are doing, and makes that a lot simpler. Because instead of having this full labor-intensive process, it's like a lot faster. And just one example of a paper we published this past year, at the end of past year, with this is data with Talkspace. This is around 20 million messages, 5,000 therapists, 200,000 clients. Every point here is the average active listening rating for a therapist. And what you see, and so there's 5,000 dots, you see a real wide distribution across all of these folks, where you've got some folks who are really, really listening actively, working hard, open questions, reflections, affirmations, things like that. You got some other folks, maybe not so much. And in the data we have, that was highly correlated. If you put all those things together, you could predict a lot of variability in satisfaction, engagement, and PHQ-9 as well. And so these sorts of tools where you automatically rate the presence of different types of interventions allow you to scale. You can do detailed process research on a scale that looks like implementation science to me as a non-implementation scientist. Where I was always frustrated with, we can do our little psychotherapy studies with 100 people in them and we can rate 100 sessions, or you've got massive amounts of data pulled from a medical record, but we can't have the level of detail about what's happening in those conversations. And I think that we're working towards a future where those sorts of issues can be solved if you can collect the data. But what's been interesting in the last few years, and really almost just in the last two, is that we're starting to see research and applications, and sadly more applications than research, on the large language model therapists and AI large language model clients. And so I think to me, this slide is quite funny, right? Where you can now do psychotherapy research that presumably you could publish in a very good journal that doesn't have any humans involved in it. You could have a AI therapist talking to an AI client evaluated by an AI rater. And so what that means is the entire data is simulated. And so what does that mean about how we're thinking about psychotherapy? And one of the things, just to full disclosure, as an undergrad, I majored in religion and philosophy before I got infected with psychotherapy science. And one of the things we read a little bit about that then I ended up reading about in psychotherapy was Martin Buber, who was a heavy influence on Carl Rogers, one of the first, the humanistic person-centered therapist, who really thought about psychotherapy as this true I-thou relationship, which is two human beings interacting with each other and treating each other as sentient beings with their own free will that should be respected. what happens when we start to treat our therapist as potentially a tool? I've talked a lot of with my friends and colleagues who are starting to work in this area where they're building these large language model therapists or clients. And I'll talk a little bit about why they would do that. People treat them differently than they would a human therapist. And so, if a silly example that I think illustrates the point, right? If you're Googling pizza near me, you don't want Google to ask you about how you're feeling and what's leading you to need pizza. You just want to know where it is. And so there's a same thing that can happen sometimes when people start to use these tools. They treat them as its that are instrumental rather than human reciprocal relationships. That affects both how they engage with them, but also how we think about training them. And so this little schematic gives you a little background to how I think people are starting to apply these concepts. And so this is just a little, every problem in the world can be reduced to a 2x2 plot, right? So you have clients who are human or AI, and you have therapists who are human or AI. And of course, the human tile is what we've been doing forever. The one I've circled here first is where the human therapist and an AI client, and we'll talk some about that research, where it's mostly for training or evaluating human therapists is the primary application that I can think of and am aware of. Then you have a place where the AI is a therapist, but the client is a human. And these are evaluations of large scale AI based psychotherapies. But then we're starting to see some research, and I'll talk about some of it, where both the AI and the client are therapists, are both the client and the therapist are AIs. And so what does that mean? What would we be doing research like that for? So here's a couple of applications. So at Listen, this is a Listen study and a clinical trial we just finished and are writing up right now. I tested this a little bit ago. This is pre-simulated clients. This is using AI to give feedback to train therapists in basic CBT skills. And so here's a vignette of one of our programmers at Listen trying to do behavioral activation.
Rosie, I mean, come on, you can't just spend the whole day in your bed. Don't you know that's not accomplishing anything? You should at least get out of bed and try and do something. Go outside, walk a dog, find something to do for goodness sake.
So what you see here is John, who's a great guy but didn't know a lot about psychotherapy, attempts to do a behavior, like explain behavioral activation. These rating systems have been trained on thousands of human expert ratings, where we go and watch people respond to these vignettes and rate how well they're doing on the application of these skills. Not only did they teach the skill well, but how interpersonally effective and empathic were they? And so you get this feedback, you can watch some additional examples, practice a little bit more, and then here's John trying to do something here a little bit later.
So, Rosie, what I hear you saying is that you don't feel well during the day, and because of that, you stay in your apartment, or you might even stay in your bed all day and just try and make it through the day, not doing anything. But by the end of the day, you feel even worse because you haven't accomplished anything. So what we want to do is we want to flip that on its head, and we want to come up with some target activities. It could be as simple as chores, or going and doing something outside, going on a walk, going and get some groceries. We want to pick out some of these target activities that can give you a sense of motivation, that can give you a sense of accomplishment throughout the day, so that you feel better and better as the day goes on and as you accomplish more things. How does that sound?
So here, moved his skill level up pretty quickly after some practice. It's mapping it onto a bunch of behavioral anchors that the coders used to rate that. And you can very quickly get feedback, practice over time. And so we published a number of initial studies on that. We just finished a implementation study across a bunch of different public mental health clinics in the Pacific Northwest and around the country. with 64 different teams, 222 providers. We randomly assigned them to either a standard training or an AI supported training like the one you just saw, where they interacted with some of these different patients and got some background information. What we found, not surprisingly, was that confidence was fine in both. It doesn't actually take skill practice to improve confidence. But even though the AI training was asking a lot more of people, people still found it accessible. Often people found it nice to have ratings from someone who felt more a little distant than being supervised by a direct supervisor, but at the same time, it was a little bit odd being rated by an AI. But it really helped demystify some of the ways in which they could respond and help them shape some of that behavior. We've showed that there was improvements in different types of symptom outcomes in the clients that our therapists tracked, as well as working alliance and other sort of functional recovery outcomes compared to the standard training. And so it does look like, as consistent with learning science, that if you give people proximal, reliable feedback, you can improve their skills. And we're writing up some of this and working on doing some mediation analyses, looking at how improvements in skill use over time related to both behavior in session, but behavior with clients as well. At Listen, we've been building out a lot of these, and so we're doing research on different sorts of trainings where we're working with experts in things like suicide prevention, ACT, DBT, motivational interviewing, other sorts of skills. We're trying to identify key skills in different trainings or treatments and then allow people to practice those skills repeatedly with feedback. We have another line of research that came out of the university, and now we're doing at Listen, where these are not pre-recorded vignettes. These are simulated large language model based clients where you can create different personas depending on the profile you want, and then practice with them, where you can have an ongoing conversation with different types of personas. And each time you have that conversation, it's going to go differently, and it depends. And some of it's random. Sometimes they're more responsive and less. And then over time, we're shaping your behavior. We're giving you feedback. This one's focused on basic active listening skills within the context of motivational interviewing. So it's labeling each skill that you have and giving you prompts depending on how that works. Then we track that skill use. We give you access to that transcript, label it, and then give you feedback over time that gives you a sense of how you're doing. We've done one initial clinical trial with lay counselors, so people without training, to show if we can just get really quick increases in skill use, where we randomly assign people to practice without and with feedback, and show that we can improve things like the use of reflections and things like that very quickly. So that's thinking about simulated patients and feedback in the context to train human therapists. One of the things we've started to think about on our team is how to use AI simulated patients to evaluate AI therapists. One of the things that's coming out now, there's an increasing number of these companies that are creating AI-based therapists, but then probably more important, and I would argue a bit dangerous, is it is one of the primary uses of these general purpose chatbots that everybody has access to, as people are using them as pseudo mental health support. And they have not been trained in that, and it's not at all clear necessarily what they're doing. And so one of the things, this is work from my colleague Tim Althoff at the University of Washington, where he's trying to think about ways to benchmark these AI therapist interactions versus human-based therapies. And so here, what Tim's doing is looking at, pick a different behavior, a conversational behavior like active listening, and compare how the large language model or the AI therapist performs compared to human therapists. And if they are over here, they're kind of looking pretty similar to a high quality therapy conversation that might rate high on a measure of fidelity. And over here, they're more similar to one that's low. And in each of these conversations, they're using a simulated client to generate these outcomes, because it's difficult to do this with humans and maybe shouldn't be done. And so here's just some examples of what that looks like if you compare different types of AI models. what they look like is they're doing a lot lower amount of problem solving work and advice giving than a high quality type session might look. But then if you go back in the other direction, they're doing a lot more reflections on strengths, like a lot more than a human therapist doing. And this is kind of consistent if you think about what these chatbot models do. They're very focused on validating and making you feel supported. And some people have started calling that problems with syncopancy, where they just really amplify whatever it is you say to them. And so one question we've thought about is, well, at some point, is just being reflective and reflecting on strengths maybe a bad thing and maybe too much, where it's not pushing back on certain types of things? And one way we've started to look at that question is in the context of testing things in specific disorders. And so how do we not just look at the quality, but understand and potentially reduce specific harms that might happen in these large language models? And so we've been working on this in particular domains to make it more of a tractable initial problem. And so one of them that we've been working on, which is not my primary area, but is an interesting one to work on, we've been working with some OCD experts to think about how these models might respond to someone who presents with certain types of symptoms related to OCD. And so you can imagine, if you start to think through it in your head, where responses that might make sense for someone else might really be problematic for someone who is struggling, for example, with a hand washing compulsion, could exacerbate symptoms. And current AI safety benchmarks that people are talking about really just don't look at this at all. And so the challenges and real opportunities here are, we could test these types of problems without exposing vulnerable populations. We allow one of the really complicated things in a lot of these AI models, they are often built and evaluated based on one response, one volley. So you say something, it evaluates it and looks at how good someone liked the response, but they're not looking at how long over time, over 10, 20, 30, 100 talk turns, how are these models doing? Then you can then improve this multi-turn AI evaluation by looking at some of these types of problems we'll talk about. So, for example, what we've tried to do is, one of the hardest problems is trying to make sure that the simulated patients you build are similar to actual real patients. And how would we do that? And I think this is a problem we haven't even come close to solving yet, but I'll talk a little bit about a version of that we've been doing. We want to try and capture the diversity of actual clients, a wide spectrum of different types of scenarios, different engagement, different types of demographics, other conditions, but we also want to incorporate a range of different types of behaviors and personas. So you could think about it, there's different types of OCD presentations, but there's also then just different styles of interaction. Are they more adversarial, where they're pushy and resistant, or are they more compliant? And so the way we've worked on building some of the current simulated patients and clients we're working with is, we first initially pull a disclosure, a persona from a Reddit post on OCD. We then use that as a prompt to create a situation using an LLM. So we create a kind of clear prompt. Then at the same time, we utilize measures from the Yale Brown, like a standard measure of the OCD, to create this client vignette. And then that forcing some diversity across a number of the different outcomes and styles. And so we've done some initial work just getting ratings of how authentic. We had some experts in OCD rate these patients as they talk to them, that this client appears authentic, that they might be a real patient I've talked to, that they stay in the role, that they answer questions in a natural manner. And so some good initial data that is helpful. The problematic scenarios that we've identified so far that we see a lot, and I'll show some examples of this here in a second. We get a lot of examples of colluding with compulsions, where the bot, rather than challenging a person, or at least not engaging with it, will go directly with the compulsion. They'll encourage avoidance, reassurance seeking, over focus on intrusive thoughts. A lot of behaviors that a person who did OCD therapy with someone with OCD would really encourage, and that is not a great idea. And so here's just one example of that type of behavior, where we have something like, okay, the client's saying, I'm really struggling a lot lately. I can barely go outside because I'm tired of touching. It's exhausting. I can't trust my own perception. And then conversation goes on. And here's where they're being a little bit more persistent. I really feel that keeping my environment clean is the only way I can manage this. Can you help me find ways? And then quickly the bot just goes into saying, well, we can certainly welcome developing strategies to help maintain that. One approach could be structured cleaning routines. And so they've basically gotten into engaging the compulsion that the person's going with, and it goes on from there. So I think one thing that we've tried to start thinking about is, as these types of tools become more common and become things that we start to think about how to evaluate when we're implementing them in systems, is we have lots of really good tools. They're labor intensive, but we have good tools for evaluating mental health treatments. We have measures of MI fidelity, we have measures of CBT fidelity, we have measures of all sorts of different things. And those can be done by humans, they can be done reliably. But if we try and use those tools to evaluate what a AI-based therapist is, they may miss some core things. These fidelity tools assume that the person is a human and is managing the things that a human might typically manage. And this is this classic quote from a early psychotherapy researcher, psychodynamic therapist Hans Strupp, that the therapy happened, but it never really occurred. And what we can see in some of these conversations is, someone will bring up a key symptom, and the bot will learn to be really, really, really adherent to a CBT measure, an MI measure, but they'll miss some of the core things that a human therapist would never miss. And so I think we have a lot of work to start to think about, how do we evaluate this new type of technology we have that is going to be very different from the one that we've relied on, which is human beings with licenses and things like that. And so I know we wanted to try and have some time for questions, so I have some more stuff, but I'm happy to wrap up here. I did want to mention one thing. My research group just published a paper, and I'm happy to send a link to this in the chat here in a little bit, or to the coordinators. That's in Current Directions of Psychological Science. That's a paper that is a framework for thinking about different forms of automation in psychotherapy. And it outlines almost like how you would think about a self-driving car. There's everything from, if you're thinking about cars, there's everything from, oh, a little light goes off in your side view mirror to tell you that something might be in the side, to fully self-driving. And in AI and psychotherapy, there really is a similar continuum. You've got potentially just annotating psychotherapy conversations all the way up to full collaboration or replacement of human therapists. And so in that case, the risks and benefits and ethical considerations between those different types of applications are really different, and we need to be thinking about them in that way. And so my hope is that this sort of work will be useful, and as we start to create new tools and do more cool stuff. So with that, I'll take a pause and see if there's questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Zac. And we would love if you send us that paper. If you're welcome to stick it in the chat, or if you want to share again with us, and we can distribute to attendees, that would be fantastic. Really lovely presentation. It's really interesting. I've been familiar with Listen and have seen some of the platform, and it's cool to see stuff that I'm not yet familiar with, particularly the different training features and the different vignettes and whatnot. So Thank you so much for sharing that. I did see that, Greg, you put a question in the chat, and certainly I want to open the door for other questions as well. But Greg, did you want to pose your question?
Sure. And thanks, Zach. As usual, you guys are doing really innovative work and appreciate that. Um, so I'm wondering, about the nature of, um, people's responses and wondering if there are any fMRI studies that compare brain activity for clinicians and patients during human therapist versus AI therapist interaction.
Yeah, if there are, I don't know of them. That's an interesting way of thinking about it. What I definitely we now have, and I would assume, I'm not sure if people are following this area as closely as I am. There are really only a couple of actual clinical trials evaluating full large language model therapists at this point. There is one that's came out of the Dartmouth group. I think Hines is the first author, and I'm forgetting the senior author. And that was doing a waitlist controlled comparison. And then there is another one that's coming out of the Slingshot AI group with their therapist called Ash, which I think is in a preprint. It just came out. And similarly, I think that one wasn't even controlled. It was more observational, just showing, people talk to this thing and they feel better at the end sort of result. And what we do have a lot of is comparing one-off responses of AI therapists and human therapists. And there's similar corollaries, and I've seen in medicine and primary care, right? You've got like a patient prompt, and then either a primary care provider responds or some prompted version of ChatGPT responds. And what I would say that my take home from that general literature is almost always the AI is seen as more helpful, right? They write a lot more, like the responses are long and they're bullet pointed and they're really polite. And they say, I really love, oh, that's a great question. I really want to be helpful to you. And have you considered these things? And like, can I help you with this? And they go over the top, whereas like the doc might be like, well, it sounds like it's this, and I wonder if you might try that. And, let me know if that doesn't work. Right. And there's this kind of, but that's one response. What we haven't done as that I've seen, and maybe the literature is moving so fast that it's very precarious to make proclamations like this. But what I haven't seen is long conversations that go on 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 talk turns, which might be more typical of a full conversation. Because what we know is that the performance of these models goes like this the further out you get from the initial prompt. And that these really long responses with tons of bullet points can be really helpful for a first response, but they can get a little much if you're getting that every time. But
Yeah.
people respond to them in ways where they find them very helpful. And I wonder what that would look like in terms of how people experience them, in their brains, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think my question was prompted by the NIMH experimental therapeutics approach, looking for the mechanisms of action. Um, but I bet those will be coming down the road at some point. So uh, I think,
I mean, I think what there is research on, and this is outside of large language model therapists, is do we form basic effective therapeutic relationships with these models? And the answer is so far they're pretty similar, at least in terms of the measures we can generate. People feel like they trust them, they like them, these sorts of things. But I do worry that the measures we have of the therapeutic relationship and alliance aren't tapping the same sorts of things that we might want to tap if we want to get at the differences between these types of things, but I'm not sure what that is yet.
Yeah, thank you for that, Zach. We have another question in the chat from Husa, and I see, Ming, you raised your hand. Maybe I'll start with the question in the chat and then we can pass it on to you. So the question in the chat, I'll just read it. Very interesting presentation and work. Thank you. Maybe I missed this, but I was wondering whether Listen is informed by a specific fidelity framework or frameworks or fidelity dimensions.
Yeah. In brief, yes. And and then of course the answer is depends on what you're talking about. So Listen's work started with motivational interviewing. The first work we trained all of our models on was based on the MISC, the motivational interviewing skills code, sort of the more robust, like detailed utterance level system for MI fidelity. We can then map that on to measures like the MIghty, if you know what that is, the more kind of easier to do, but still pretty darn labor intensive measure. And then we've trained CBT models on the CTRS, the standard kind of cognitive therapy rating scale. In the case of the trainings, it's been a little more interesting because one particular limitation of a lot of models for CBT is they're not utterance based, the fidelity models. And so there is no utterance level fidelity system for the CTRS that could rate whether or not this specific statement that you've made is adherent to CBT. And so what we've done in each of those cases is work with the expert trainers to more or less start with versions of the CTRS, the items, and then boil them down into utterance-based responses given the patient profile you're working with. And that kind of varies across the different types of things you're doing. But yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Zac. Ming, I'll pass it to you, and then maybe Maddie. I saw your hand go up.
Thank you. So Zac, fascinating work. So we worked together, gosh, many, many years ago. I think before Listen is Listen, so that was that long ago. I wanted your thoughts on whether AI could serve as a peer supporter. It seems the literature is pretty strong, like a well-trained or good peer support. Oftentimes, I think people with lived experience can provide support to the person seeking help or receiving help from therapist. But it's hard to find people with lived experience and train them and have them being able to show up at appointments and provide the kind of support that could be, effective. So what are your thoughts about that?
I have a couple. Maybe I'll start a little bit sideways and then get back to that primary question. So I think in some ways, could you build such a peer, like an AI-based peer? For sure. And I'm aware of things like that. Could you do a good job of simulating what they do and say? Yes. And I almost wonder if it's the exact wrong use case because it undermines the very thing that peers are supposed to be doing, which is this sense of shared experience, which oddly the bot would do, but it would be by definition lying. Like it hasn't had those experiences. It could say it has, right? And it could learn. I mean, you could create a profile that is a peer who's had X, Y, and Z, and you could train it on a bunch of data from the types of things peers would say, and it would say those things. And what I'm wrapping my mind around like what that would mean exactly. I mean, it feels a little bit like the kind of AI girlfriend or companion thing where people might like it at some level, but I'd be curious about ways to measure the distinction between feeling universality with an AI that is simulated to connect with you and versus one like a real connection with a human peer. And I'm both like feel like we could figure that out somehow and worried that it would be very hard to find any differences. What I was going to say is where I am aware of ongoing work that I'm really find interesting is using AI to support peers. So one of the things you might be worried about with peers is like, yes, they have a lot of skills related to lived experience, but it's harder skill them up in different styles of communication or more evidence-based practice we might want to use. So what if we could build frameworks and systems that would support them and give them that feedback in an ongoing way to help shape their behavior? So maybe we get the peer part, but we'd also get them functioning maybe at a level that's similar to a well-trained person. And that there you get the best of both worlds, right? But I think we really need to think, this is where I was trying to get at with this I, thou, I, it thing in AI relationships, where it seems like the issues we're having are when people start to treat these AIs as if they are other humans and they start building relationships with them. And then problems ensue, right? Because they aren't humans and they do things that you wouldn't expect humans to do, and they will say things and lead you down paths that might be problematic. And so I'm worried about such a thing, but I don't know. Maybe if done in the right way.
I really appreciate your response. I think it's a brilliant idea of having AI to support the peer. So
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both. Maybe we could squeeze in, Maddie, your questions, and depending on how quick it is, Prerna, we can go to you next.
I'll try and be fast.
Thank you both. Go ahead, Maddie.
Yes. So I'm not in the therapy space. I'm in the IO space, but we partner with InStep. I'm at UCF. I was just wondering if you guys had the opportunity with Listen to partner with any more assessment centers, because it seems like your software would be very applicable in that space and understanding kind of like those role play opportunities. I was wondering if you guys had.
What I should probably know this, but what do you mean by assessment center?
Assessment center just is basically like a battery of tests, whether that's interviews, role play opportunities, surveys that companies will put applicants through, whether that's like a leadership development opportunity and they're used for training or for like selecting officers. You'll see them often in like the police and law
Or like
enforcement.
interview and selection sort of. Yeah, I mean, the answer is no. And if anything, we're starting to experience pain from the amount of AI that's involved in the hiring process right now at Listen, because most of the application materials we appear to get are AI generated. But and then people are always shocked when we interview them and we're humans that are on the other end of the interview. So I would assume, I know a lot of that work's ongoing. We haven't done that. We've been more focused on evaluating for better or worse, the therapy stuff.
Thanks.
Yeah, interesting question, Maddie. Thank you. Prerna, maybe we can sneak in your question.
Thanks, Marissa. Hi, Zac. So nice to meet you. Great presentation. I'm Prerna Martin. I'm the Director of Program Evaluation and an Assistant Professor at the Baumer Institute for Children's Behavioral Health at the University of Oregon. And we are training a new bachelor's level workforce to increase reach of mental health interventions for kids and embedding them in child-focused settings. So, of course, we are constantly thinking about, tools that we can use to scale training, scale supervision, get our students to competency. I have two quick questions. One on your tool that can help like a potential practitioner up-level their skills. Can it take into account like where they are developmentally in their training and adjust accordingly? So somebody who's just started a training program, somebody who or is further along or is actually in the workforce. And the second question I have is, do you have a parallel product right now for training supervisors in evidence-based supervision practices? Because when we send this workforce out to community settings, they're trained in all these great evidence-based interventions, but often the supervisors there do not use the parallel evidence-based practices in their own supervision. So
It's a great question. And I will say it is not the account managers and teams that we have at Listen. It's when things get kind of pushed up from the first level of review, often it'll be because a supervisor disagrees with some of the feedback we've given.
Interesting.
And I don't want to sort of create the impression that somehow our feedback is 100% effective all the time. It absolutely is not. Just like a human rater that our models are trained on, it sometimes makes mistakes, and there will be times when a supervisor emails us, and our response is absolutely, we missed that one, right? And we take that feedback in and use it to make it better. However, it is also not uncommon that the supervisor is wrong. And you've got to be sensitive and careful with how you do that. But when you talk to them, be like, oh, really good feedback. Sometimes people see this. And so we often find that our feedback can be more reliable than the supervisors who are using it with their trainees. And so that can be a challenge when in a variety of ways. We couple of questions. One of them is, in principle, and something we're working on right now, is how to dynamically adjust the difficulty of the patient profiles to work with where the person's at. Because if it's too hard when they start, it'll be discouraging and people will quit. We have built all of the trainings we've started with to not assume any knowledge at all. And so we basically build them as, forgive the sports metaphor, as like the T-ball version of learning how to hit, right? And what I would say sometimes is, even for experts, the best hitters in baseball hit off tees their whole life. They never stop. They always are in getting reps to practice their skills. Steph Curry didn't stop shooting 3-point shots because he got good at it in practice. The reason he's good at it is because he shoots all the time. And so a lot of the basic skills that we have people practice in these trainings, I think, even though they can be done with beginners, are useful for experts as well. But I do think we need to be working on building and in principle, that's true, and something we're working on, where they can take someone who's ready to do something a little bit more challenging, and that might even keep it more interesting for them. And so did I hit everything you asked? I think I did, but I may have missed something.
Thank you. Yeah, I will definitely be following up with you. It's great to connect. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. We're nearing the top of the hour, and so I might have us wrap up here with the end of that question. Thank you all so much for your brilliant questions, and thank you, Zac, for joining us today and guiding this discussion and leaving such wonderful time for questions. I'm curious, if folks want to get a hold of you, what might be the best way they do so?
My university email is online, but the easiest one to just say quickly is Zac@Listen.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much. And that's helpful for us to know if folks, if they weren't able to catch that but want to reach out to you, we can be. Oh, there you go. You're so quick. You plopped it in the chat. Well, again, thank you so much for coming today. Thank you for the really fantastic presentation.
Appreciate y'all having me.
Yes, of course.